We have just been hearing about his new book titled What's So Great About America? And at this point I would like Dinesh to give us a little overview of what he has covered in this latest bestseller.
Well, the book is a look at various critiques of America, the Islamic critique, the left-wing critique of American foreign policy, the people who say American culture is decadent and immoral, the people who say American history is defined by slavery and racism. So if all these criticisms are true, it's hard to see why America is worth defending. So in this book, I patiently try to look at these criticisms, but also to answer them.
One of the things that we noticed in your discussion was that the Islamic community, or that part of your book, mentions the fact that they've taken the moral high ground. What's your defense of America against the fact that they feel we're a decadent society?
I think behind the intellectual, behind the physical attack on America, there was an intellectual attack. And some of the Egyptian and Islamic thinkers, they say American society is based on freedom, but Islamic society is based on virtue. And they say virtue is a higher principle than freedom because freedom is often used badly. Now, I think that there is an element of truth in the Islamic critique that says that there is a lot in American culture that is sometimes trivial or excessive. But what the Islamic critics often miss is that while virtue is an important goal in society, freedom is needed to achieve virtue. In other words, without freedom there is no virtue. If a woman in Afghanistan or Iran is required to wear a veil, in a sense you can say she is not modest because she's being compelled. It's only when you can choose freely that you can choose the good.
Well, how would you defend against the Muslims who would say that, well, Britney Spears is the antithesis of everything that the Muslim community holds dear, and they feel that that's a vital threat to their national or international sovereignty?
Well, part of the problem is that the reason the Muslim elites are terrified is not because Americans, but rather young Muslims want to listen to Britney Spears. I mean, if the young Muslims didn't want to listen to Britney Spears, she would pose absolutely no threat to their society at all. But it's precisely because there is something appealing and attractive and enticing about American culture that the people who are the leaders in that culture want to keep the American influence out. I think part of looking at America purely in terms of its popular culture is not always accurate or fair. I mean, my mom sitting in her living room in Bombay, India, will look at the Jerry Springer show and all the various freaks and so on the show and say, well, is that how Americans really are? Well, I think in America we know that that's not how most Americans live. That's sort of the modern equivalent of the circus. But nevertheless, for people living abroad, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between some of the elements of popular entertainment and the way Americans really live.
Why is the Muslim world now attacking us?
There are a couple of reasons. I think the main one is that Islam used to be perhaps the world's greatest civilization. And in one of the great seesaw movements of history, Islam has gone down and Western civilization and America have come up. And so the people in the Islamic world are looking at America, I think, with a certain degree of frustration and bitterness and perhaps even envy. And so part of what's going on is a lashing out against a more successful civilization that is commanding the fascination and the appeal of much of the world.
One of the things that's been mentioned sometimes is the fact that there are lots of have-not nations in the Islamic world, and they feel that America should give back something to them. I guess my question to you is, what's the resolution? Where do we go for a resolution between Islam and the Western civilizations?
The dispute between Islam and the West, I think, is not fundamentally an economic conflict. Bin Laden himself is one of the richest men in the world. He belongs probably on the Forbes 400 rich list. And most of the terrorists who came from middle to upper middle class families. So this is not a case of the wretched of the earth lashing out against people who have more. I think the roots of this conflict are religious and political and ideological. They're not fundamentally economic.
You verge on an area that's interesting in that we're looking at racial profiling in this country as a big thing prior to 9/11, and now afterwards the issues are against the Muslim community or against Arabs in general. What's your belief on that?
There was an interesting survey among African Americans in America asking them what they thought about racial profiling. 71% said they were in favor of racial profiling for Arabs. And what this shows is that racial profiling is not a mere extension of racism. Rather, it is an application of common sense. In the area of homeland security, racial profiling is based on the recognition that the average Swede is much less likely to pose a threat to America than the average Muslim. If your name is Sven, you are less of a danger on average than if your name is Muhammad. Now that's common sense, it's not bigotry. And yet, once again, the country goes to great lengths to try to say, listen, if your name is Muhammad and you're a law-abiding citizen, we're going to try to do everything to protect your rights. Now, if my name was Muhammad and I was always asked to take off my shoes and always be searched and so on, and I was a law-abiding guy, I would in fact be irritated, I would in fact be angry. But I wouldn't be angry at the airport security guys or at the cops or at the FBI. I would be angry at the 19 terrorists who are giving Muslims a bad name.
One of the things with John Ashcroft now, of course, is the fact that there's a lot of look, even from the conservative community, about our civil rights and about the fact that there's going to be a lot more invasive government intervention into our lives. Have you looked at that issue and decided whether that's positive or negative for the society?
I think that our principles of freedom are paramount, and yet it is true that in a time of a war, certain of those freedoms are temporarily sacrificed. I think our history shows that these sacrifices are temporary. There was liberties suspended during the Civil War, during World War II. Those liberties were immediately restored when the war was over. I don't see any mass-scale surveillance of American citizens. I do think that we've got to do a better job on the borders. I don't find any threat to our liberty in asking people to produce their fingerprints and checking them against criminal records and so on. I think those things are essential. Ultimately, I do think it's very difficult for a free society to truly protect its homeland because of the enemy to attack is just too great. Many of us are focusing now on should we arm the pilots and should we have better screening techniques at the airports. But see, that all assumes that the terrorists having attacked at the airports are going to do the same thing all over again. Chances are they won't. And it's very difficult to anticipate every threat at every point and erect a fortress against it. So I think our best hope in the war is offensive, to go after the Al-Qaeda network and after the terrorists and defeat them where they are, rather than trying to stop them at the water's edge.
One of those things that you mentioned in your 70-year today was the fact that the 70-year conflict with the Soviet Union may pale in comparison to the longer war against this Muslim and Christendom battle that's going on. So what you're saying is that we should look for less freedoms in this country based on the fact that there will be a consistent threat to our society?
Well, it remains to be seen. So far, the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon has not been duplicated, even though there have been threats and there have been some arrests. So the issue here is, I think, yes, if the terrorist threats continue, the response from the United States will be very severe militarily, and also America will have to do more of what Israel does. And even Israel is not that successful at it, which shows how difficult it is to protect completely against the most lethal of the terrorist threats, which is the human bomb. The guy who walks into a store and is willing to blow himself up. That's a very difficult threat to insure against completely. So we'll see how much long-term fortitude Islamic fundamentalists have in keeping this fight going.
Dinesh, I've got a question for you, another topic of yours, and it relates to affirmative action. Can you share with us your views on, perhaps explain why you believe it's failed?
Well, I think affirmative action, looked over the last few decades, it has done some good. It has helped to produce a black middle class. But on the other hand, I think we are at a point in our history where we have, in a sense, been giving preferences to minorities now for almost a generation. Affirmative action was intended to be temporary. It is a clear abrogation of violation of the principle of equal rights under the law. It essentially establishes two categories of citizen, the preferred citizen and the second-class citizen. I think that's fundamentally un-American. And so I think the time has come to basically shut the door down on affirmative action. This doesn't mean shutting the door down on helping the poor, but it means shutting the door down on helping people because they belong to one particular race or another.
One of the issues that they bring up is, of course, the giant multinational corporations, and many of the indigenous people of the world as well across our globe all consider that multinational corporations are an extreme danger to their survival. What's your read on multinational corporations in general?
Well, my guess is, my feeling is that the multinational corporations, I mean, first of all, there's no country that has to have them. Most countries want them for an obvious reason. They bring capital, they create new jobs, and usually they pay better than the local wage. So while a lot of protesters will say, oh, you know, the IBM is paying only $7 a day in Thailand, they pay, you know, $15 an hour in America. The fact is that the $7 a day is often higher than the Thai going rate of $4 a day, and that's why people are lining up around the block to work for IBM or Procter & Gamble. Now, to the protesters who want to erect tariff barriers or require that the corporations pay $15 an hour to Thai workers as well, well, that's a guaranteed way of making sure that the corporations don't hire any Thai workers, because the reason they go there is because the labor is cheaper. And so the remedies proposed by the protesters would harm the poorest people in Thailand who stand to benefit from working. Not only do they benefit by working in multinational corporations, but the fact that the multinational corporations are paying more puts pressure on all the local employers to pay more as well. So I think on balance the corporations are a force for good. This is not to justify individual abuses here and there, but by and large I think the spread of American capitalism is raising living standards all over the world.
That's one issue, though, that when we close doors to American manufacturing in this country, and we close doors to companies in this country, and then move them to other countries that have better, as you said, better labor prices and real estate prices, do you think that's an American thing to do?
Well, I think it's what you have in the case of trade is a clash between the interests of two groups of Americans, the producer and the consumer. So, for example, an American shoemaker might charge $12 an hour. Maybe a guy in Mexico will make that same shoe for $4 an hour. The result of that is that the shoe costs $35 instead of $75. So the American consumer benefits from the cheaper shoe. So I don't think this is an issue of Americans versus Mexicans. It's really a policy question within America of whether we want to protect the interests of American workers against American consumers. It's not obvious to me how we should decide that.
Dinesh, a question for you. What do you see as your vision of the future of this country 20 years down the road as we go into a service country? What kind of education would you like your children and grandchildren to pursue? What professions?
I think our economy is in strong shape. I think that America, a country's economy should be based on what it does best. And what America does best is it invents things, it refines things, it is fantastic in providing marketing, consumer services, and so on. It is the leading edge of technology. And so America should do those things. American farmers make are the most productive in the world. But the fact is that a relatively small number of people in farming can feed all of America and perhaps most of the world. So the American economy, I think, is in good shape. Our education system is not in as good a shape. I'd like to see more efforts to rebuild not only educational standards, but also the sense of civic patriotism, that Americans are in it together, we're one country. And the public schools, which used to do that, they used to be a kind of melting pot, have stopped doing that. And so I think there needs to be educational reform in that direction.
That goes back to one thing else. Let's close this off with some thoughts about, you're an immigrant, you came from a foreign country here. Immigration is a big topic of discussion in this country. In fact, all over the world, in France and Germany, they're restricting their immigration of foreigners. What do you think American immigration policy should be at this point?
I think that America can afford to take a fairly large number of immigrants, but it has every right to specify how many immigrants and from where and what kind of immigrants. It's simply not true that there is a universal right to emigrate. Every country should be able to decide who gets to come. And second, I think America should not only encourage, but in a way insist that the immigrants assimilate. By that I mean learn English, embrace the American Constitution and laws, and embrace the American way of life. Americans don't have race or blood in common, and therefore it's all the more important that they have certain moral ideals in common, and that's what makes one American be willing to make a sacrifice for another. And so, yes, I think we need to strengthen our common culture. and we need to have the immigrants assimilate to the American way of life, and that way I think the immigration problem will be a lot less than it is now.
Dinesh D'Souza, thank you so much for joining us on The Cutting Edge. It was a real pleasure to have you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.